I really hope Elvis has left the building, because it's not easy to compete that. And my dancing skills are not that good, so I'll keep to this presentation. Now, I was requested to speak about the current situation in Israel. And it's very important to realize the current situation in Israel. But as I went on building this presentation, preparing it, I got to the realization that one cannot understand the current situation without understanding the roots of the situation in Israel. So the country was established, as we know, 67 years ago, and the problems, the challenges didn't begin then, and I will speak about the roots of the problems in the region, and this ambitious project that is called the State of Israel. The difficulties, the challenges. So on 14th of May, 1948, it was a Friday, Israel was established as the nation state of the Jewish people. The Jewish people that didn't realize its right to have a sovereign nation state for more than 2,000 years, since the Roman Empire took the land and deported all the Jews from it. It was around 63 BC. So that's more than 2,000 years of exile. That natural right that the Jews had for their own nation state, their national aspirations, was acknowledged by the UN in 1947, but was never, as we know, accepted very well in the region we live in. Jews were living in Israel, in the region, ever since, for all through those 2,000 years. But I think that it's important to point out this year, 1882, that is very significant in the history of Zionism, the history of the Jewish people coming back to its homeland. According to estimates, we can't really know for sure, but according to estimates, 1881, in this land, in Israel, there were about 25,000 Jews and about 200,000 Arabs. That's an estimate, but it's an historical estimate, and we have to respect that. And the Jews were living mainly in 4 cities in Eretz Israel, because, of course, Israel wasn't established yet. In that area, Jews, those 25,000 Jews were living in Tiberias and in Tzefat and in Jerusalem and in Hebron, mostly out of religious reasons. But let's look at this era, 1882. Europe in that years, we see a lot of rising of nationalistic aspirations by many nations. We're talking about the Austrian-Hungarian Empire. That's the big red chunk in the middle that we see. And it consisted of many nations that started to have those aspirations. That fact led several Jewish scholars, and also the fact that the Jews suffered from a lot of riots and pogroms, that also arose the Jewish nationalistic aspiration. In that context, who is very well known for being the father of Zionism is Theodor Herzl. However, we have to understand that he was not the first one. Before them here, there was Rabbi Alkalai and Arav Kalisher and Moshe Hess that already in 1862 published the book called Rome and Jerusalem. That was the first public declaration of the aspiration of the Jewish people to establish a homeland in their historical territory in the Middle East. However, what made Herzl more known and special, that he didn't only write and didn't only talk, he acted. He met everyone, from the Russians to the British to the Pope, and spread out the idea all through Europe, all through the leaders. He also met with the Sultan of the Ottoman Empire to promote the idea of Zionism. Now, back then, in the Middle East, the Ottoman Empire was in charge of all the region. We have to understand that back then there weren't any states at all. Syria did not exist, nor did Lebanon, Egypt, Jordan. It was all one region. The region that today is Israel and the Palestinian territories was not even called Palestine. That name wasn't in use. It was called Southern Syria. The Southern Syria region was divided into counties that everyone paid taxes that all went directly to Istanbul, to the Sultan. So, and as I said, 25,000 Jews were living in the region back then, especially in Tiberias and Tzefat and Jerusalem and Hebron. And the estimate was between 150,000 to 250,000 Arabs. We don't have real numbers, but that's the estimate. Palestine was not a name in use. It was Southern Syria. Now, another important date that we should mark is 1917. In that year, now we have better evaluations because the British, who took over the country after World War I, did conduct very accurate censuses of the population. So we know that about 85,000 Jews were living in the region of what is now the State of Israel and the Palestinian territories, and about 650,000 Arabs. Now, in December 1917, you see in the picture General Allenby from the United Kingdom's army walked in Jaffa towards the Jaffa Gate. That symbolizes the beginning of a new era in this area of the British Mandate. Now, the British Mandate did change the name of the region. They changed it to Palestine. And, of course, what was east of the Jordan River was called Transjordan. The whole of that, which is today Israel and Jordan, was under the British Mandate. Now, they called it Palestine, but the first time in history that the word Palestine, Palestina, the Provincia Syria Palestina, was used by the Romans. The Roman Empire, who took over in the 1st century. And they did that. They changed the name. Of course, it was named Judea before that. That was the name of the Jewish kingdom. And the Romans, their aim was to cut off the relationship of the Jewish people to its homeland. So they exiled the Jewish people and changed the name from Judea, which was illegal to call the country Judea anymore. They changed it to Syria Palestina. Of course, they changed later on the name of the cap of Jerusalem to Ilia Capitolinia from the same reasons. Now back to 1917. In 1917, the British started their rule over the country, and immediately, and this was the biggest achievement for the Zionist movement, to the acknowledgement of the British Empire that the Jewish people deserve and have the right for their own nation state in the region. And that was the escalation of the relationship between the Arabs living in the country to the Jewish people, who by now have had higher numbers and won the acknowledgement of the empire ruling. Lord Balfour was the foreign minister of the British Empire, and in his declaration, and it's marked here in red, it says that the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people. That was the biggest achievement, that was followed also by the San Remo Conference from 1920 that enforced this Balfour Declaration. In San Remo, they also decided, and according to the Sykes-Picot Agreement prior to the end of the World War victory by the Allies, back in 1916, they decided to have Syria and Lebanon handed to the French for a French mandate, and Palestine, Transjordan, and Iraq was given to the British, to the United Kingdom. In 1916, the Middle East, as we know it today, was evolved, was created actually. The state of Syria was created, at least on paper. The state of Iraq was created. Those states did not exist prior to this. Jordan and Palestine. Later on, Lebanon. Now, current situation, speaking of current situation, in recent years, and since the beginning of the Arab Spring some years ago, we can finally see that this Sykes-Picot thing is collapsing. The nation-states that were the agenda of the empires of the past is collapsing. Syria is not the Syria that we knew for the past 100 years, nor is Iraq. Those are failed countries, failed states that are collapsing, and it's still early to tell how this will end up. Now, I arrived to Norway 5 months ago. I'm a fairly new diplomat here. But what I heard here a lot, and it's great to see a hall full of Israeli supporters and dear friends, but what I hear a lot from people who are not like yourselves, and for critics of Israel, that the occupation in 1967, that is the origin of all the violence in the region. Some say the origin for all the violence in the world. I bear to differ on that. That's false. In 1920, there was violence in the region of Arabs towards Jews. In the Nebi Musa riots, 6 Jews were murdered. Then a year later, the Jaffa riots, 17 Jews were murdered. In 1929, everybody knows about the Hebron riots, where Jews were massacred in Hebron, babies, women, children. And between 1936 to 1939, the Great Arab Revolt against the British mandate to Palestine, and more than 600 Jews were murdered. Those violent incidents, of course, had nothing to do with the 1967 occupation, because they were before. Now, who is leading those riots? Who is in charge of the incitement? Who is leading the Arab population in Palestine? The leader, the Mufti of Jerusalem, and the most powerful, prominent figure, is Haj Amin al-Husseini. Now, he was an ally of the Nazi regime in Germany, but going back to current situation, we all know about BDS, and I'll talk more about the BDS movement later on. BDS is not a new thing. His roots begin right here. Now, the Haj Amin al-Husseini had his first meeting in March 1933 in Jerusalem with the German consul, Dr. Heinrich Wolf, who of course sent a cable back to Berlin for the Nazi leaders to read. He says that he meets in Jerusalem a very enthusiastic ideologist against the Jewish population. He says that the final agenda, of course, would be for the Germans to conquer Palestine and to exterminate all the Jews in Israel. But moreover, he says that the best way to act before that would be to boycott all Jewish goods, all Jewish products from the Jewish yeshuv in Israel. This was prior to the state. Dr. Heinrich Wolf says that this is a good idea. And of course, the Nazis started boycotting at the same time Jewish businesses in Germany and in Europe, and all through the countries that they took over. Now, after the Great Arab Revolt, which took the lives of 600 Jews, but also a lot of British soldiers, the British Empire started to realize that something has to change here. And they assembled a commission called the Peel Commission. That this is actually the first time that this two-state solution comes up to a public notion. And the Peel Commission says that in this area of Israel, there are two national groups. Their national aspirations are incompatible. The Arabs desire to revive the traditions of the Arab Golden Age. The Jews desire to show what they can achieve when restored to the land in which the Jewish nation was born. That's the Peel Commission. Of course, that at the same time, something else happens in Europe. The World War II breaks, and that takes all the attention of the British agenda from this region to Europe. The Israeli yeshuv, the Jewish yeshuv in Israel, was an ally of Britain, of Great Britain back then. And during the war, about 38,000 of the yeshuv, of the Jewish people in Israel, volunteered to assist the British in their war against Nazi Germany and their allies. Now, 38,000 people of the Jewish population is a vast number. If you take under consideration that about 430,000 Jews were in Palestine. This is a good example. Moshe Dayan lost his eye as he was in the Palmach, and he lost an eye in a battle in Syria and Lebanon with the British army that were in a war in Syria and Lebanon against the French forces of Vichy, an ally of Hitler. But, however, Palestine was not the main focus in those years. Europe was suffering the Nazi regime, the Nazi conquest. And the Jewish people lost 6 million of its people. Also, 764 Jewish Norwegians lost their lives in the Holocaust. The British Empire, after the war, was in very bad shape. The economy was devastated. 449,000 British lives were lost, of which 61,000 civilians. We can't understand those numbers for today when we think of Great Britain. The last thing they needed was more problems. The British Empire could not hold all its colonies around the world. And so in 1946, they withdrew from Transjordan. In 1947 from Jordan. And they also decided in 1947 to withdraw from Palestine. They had the Peel Commission who recommended to divide the countries, the region into two different countries. And in 1947, they gave the mandate to the UN, who was rather new. It was only 3 years old back then, in 1947. And the UN was now in charge to have a solution to the problem of Palestine. In 1947, the UN had a special committee on Palestine, and these are the things that they had to take under consideration. First of all, you see here on the map, the green areas is where the Jewish population was concentrated in the area. But they had other facts to take under consideration. So those green areas held 650,000 Jews. 1.2 million Arabs all over the country, but, and this is very important, also 1 million Jewish refugees in Europe that could not go back to the places where they lived in because all of their communities were perished, and we know of incidents that Jews went back to their homeland, to their lands, and to their homes in Poland, and suffered more pogroms. And also over 800,000 Jewish refugees from Arab and Muslim countries, a fact that a lot of people tend to forget or to ignore. The UN committee decided the partition of the land of Palestine. We know the maps. 55% of mandatory Palestine would go to the Jewish state, 45% to the Arab state. Jerusalem and Bethlehem, which are less than 1% of the whole region, will be left under international mandate, but for the UN. This plan was not perfect. It kept about 500,000 Arabs in the area of the Jewish land, and about 10,000 Jews in the area of the Arab land. The territorial continuity of the country, of the two states, of course, was not ideal, but that's the plan. It's the best that the UN thought it could do under the circumstances. The next day of declaration, of course, the Jewish Yishuv accepted the partition plan. The Arabs did not. And the war for the Jewish independence broke at the same day. Now, until May 14th, 1948, the war was mainly between the Jewish population and the Arab population inside Palestine. After May 48, the war spread over to also involve Arab countries at the perimeter. 6 Arab countries. Now, a few things, a few points I think is very important to remember. There was no Palestine before, during, or after this war. A lot of people think that Israel took over, occupied from Palestine. Palestine never existed. So the Egyptian army occupied Gaza from who? From an Arab area. The Transjordan army, it was still called Transjordan back then, that country that is now Jordan, together with the Iraqi forces, occupied the West Bank, from West Bank of the Jordan River all the way to the east part of Jerusalem. In this war, 6,373 Israelis lost their lives. That's 1% of the entire Jewish population. And a vast number of Arab casualties also. And a new state was born, the State of Israel. The borders changed. And also the problem of the Palestinian refugees was emerged. 150,000 Arabs remained in the area of the Jewish state of Israel, and they still represent 20% of the country's population today. 280,000 Arabs were living in the West Bank. 190,000 were living in Gaza. And 600,000, and that data is according to UNRWA, which is the UN's organization for the development and taking care of the Palestinian refugees, which, by the way, only the Palestinians have their own refugee organization for the UN. Today we're talking about 5 million, according to UNRWA, 5 million Palestinian refugees. The majority of them are in Syria and Lebanon and in Jordan, but also all over the world. Only by UNRWA, a Palestinian refugee is still a refugee for the 4th generation. That's why the number today is 5 million Palestinian refugees. In 1967, the Six-Day War, which took the lives of 779 Israelis, 21,500 Arabs from the armies of Jordan, Syria, and Egypt were killed. This was a phenomenal military achievement for Israel, for young Israel, and the whole world was really amazed by Israel's military capacities. And Arabs, the Arab states, were surprised, and the notion in the Israeli society was of euphoria, and the belief was that they will never dare to attack us again after this. Of course, that was wrong. Only 6 years later, they attacked again. That was the year that Israel occupied from Transjordan the West Bank. Jordan annexed the West Bank in 1950, and the Gaza Strip from the Egyptians, and the Sinai Peninsula from the Egyptians, and the Golan Heights from the Syrians. Now, the Palestinians never asked for their own independence and for their own state for 20 years. From 1948, when the Jordanians and the Egyptians occupied land, until 1967. For 20 years, they did not ask for independence. After the war, the whole Arab leaders were at a Khartoum, that's in Sudan. They gathered to discuss what will be the future. How will they deal with this humiliating loss? In that conference in Khartoum, there were invitees from Egypt, Nasser, the president, Jordan, Lebanon, Iraq, Sudan, Algeria, and Syria. The Palestinians were not invited to this conference because they were not taken seriously by the Arab world. However, one representative, Ahmed Shukeri, later the leader of the PLO, was present, but he left the discussions in the middle because he was upset by the way it was conducted and the fact that the Palestinians were not taken seriously, according to him. Well, the three famous no's from the Khartoum resolution: no to peace with Israel, no to recognition of Israel, no to negotiations with Israel. Jerusalem was not in the... Okay, now I'm talking about the UN resolution 242, also after the war. The UN decided that Israel should bring back all their areas, and no more conflict between the sides, between the parties. It also talked a great much about the Palestinian refugees, and that is one of the major issues that we deal with today. But it was not specific. It said the refugee problem should be dealt with, but it did not say which refugees. And I'm mentioning this because, as I said, there are more than 800,000, some say even more, 900,000 Jewish refugees from Arab countries in the region. Now, regarding the 242 resolution, Israel withdrew till this present day for more than 90% of the areas occupied back in 1967. It gave back Sinai to the Egyptians and the Gaza Strip to the Palestinians. That's more than 90%. The Palestinian National Covenant that it started in 1964, but it was finalized in 1968 after the Six-Day War. In one sentence, it says, I won't exhaust you with all the articles in it, but in one sentence, it says that there is no room for a Jewish state in this region, and the whole of the country should be Palestine, one big Palestine. It calls for an armed struggle against Israel. That's the legitimacy of terror that they used for decades. However, Article 33, I do want to mention, because it says that this covenant can only be changed with a majority of 2/3 of the National Congress, the National Palestinian Congress. Now, since that never happened, the covenant is still relevant. It's still it's still valid today. It was never changed. Even though declarations of stop believing in several ideologies like the annihilation of Israel were made by Palestinian leaders, the covenant, which is the legal platform, was never changed. And then for decades, we see terror attacks against Israel that took lives of hundreds of Israelis. Buses were kidnapped and people were murdered. In 1972, the Munich Olympic Games, 11 Israeli athletes were murdered. And the Litani operation in 1978, that eventually led in 1982 to an overall war that started against terrorist Palestinian organization in southern Lebanon, then developed also to a war with Syria. In 1987, the first Intifada, this event is important because this changed the international perspective of this conflict. And also inside of Israel, the Israeli population realized that we can't keep on this together forever. The Palestinian people in the West Bank and in the Gaza Strip, we should respect international aspirations. Not all of the Israeli population came to these conclusions, but the majority did come to a conclusion that we have to work towards an agreement, towards a settled agreement with the Palestinians. Negotiations began. There were secret negotiations here at Oslo, and in September 1993, the first agreement, historical moment, between Israel and Palestine, the Oslo Accords. Oslo, of course, was a traumatic experience for the Israeli population because it was continued by the most terrible terror attacks inside of Israel. Then in 2000, the Camp David summit. The Palestinians were offered back then 91% of the West Bank, including area swaps. Arafat refused, and he came to a strategic decision to start once again with an armed struggle. This armed struggle, as we know, the Second Intifada, was terrible and very traumatic to Israel, but it was a real catastrophe for the Palestinians. Between 2000 and 2005, all the Palestinian organizations, including Fatah, which is considered to be moderate, but it wasn't moderate in those times, they were involved in terrible terror attacks against inside Israeli cities, including suicide bombs. More than 1,100 Israelis lost their lives in those 5 years. I can be witnessing from my own perspective, being a young adult back then, being during my military service, that was a traumatic experience for Israel. March of 2002, we call it Black March. More than 100 Israelis murdered in terror attacks in that single month. The Intifada, Israel was managed to make it go down, the level of violence. It had nothing to do with a Palestinian decision to stop violence, but I would say, namely, the security fence, which was proven to be very efficient to prevent penetration of terrorists from the Gaza Strip and the West Bank into Israel. And also the decision in 2005 to withdraw unilaterally from the Gaza Strip. 8,600 Jews were evacuated from the Gaza Strip, and it was by the last centimeter, and according to the line of 1967, this event was very, very emotional in Israeli society. It was a big dispute among the Israeli society, but that was the decision made. That was summer of 2005. A few months later, January 2006, there was elections in Palestine, and Hamas won those elections. 2007, Hamas takes over very violently the Gaza Strip, and hundreds of Fatah members in the Gaza Strip were executed and murdered by Hamas. Israel actually assisted and saved the lives of 300 Fatah members and helped them to cross the border from Gaza through Israel to the West Bank. Ever since then, and now we're 8 years after that, there is a political disconnection between the Gaza Strip and the West Bank. Almost two different political entities. And even though there was a joint government, it's not the reality. There's a lot of resentment between them, and it's two different entities. In November 2007, there were discussions in Annapolis, led by George W. Bush. And after those discussions, in 2008, Ehud Olmert, Prime Minister of Israel, suggested the most generous suggestion the Palestinians ever had from Israel, and probably will ever get. It's an historical moment. He later described it as a very historical moment for him, and he felt the burden of history on his shoulders. I mean, the Prime Minister Olmert. He suggested 94% of Israeli withdrawal from the West Bank and swaps of lands in a formulation of 1 meter to 1 meter. We also agreed the return of 5,000 refugees, of Palestinian refugees, into Israel. It's a symbolic number, but of course Israel could never accept what the Palestinians would like to happen, the return of 5 million Palestinian refugees into the state of Israel, because of course that would mean the immediate annihilation of the Jewish state. What also historical in what Ehud Olmert suggested to Abu Mazen was to end Israeli regime in eastern Jerusalem. Abu Mazen was surprised. He never accepted such a generous proposal. But he said to Ehud Olmert, and this was in 4 eyes, but Ehud Olmert gave interviews after. He said that he needs time to think. Ehud Olmert told him, you have to sign. This is an historical moment. Don't miss this. We can now end this conflict. We can be marked in history as the one ending this conflict. Abu Mazen said, I need time to think. I need to go back to Ramallah and to present this offer, and I'll get back to you. He was supposed to get back to him in the following day. Then he delayed it to the following week. Then it never happened. He never got back. The Palestinians, led by Abu Mazen, decided strategically to fight Israel in a unilateral way by addressing UN organizations and not by the path of negotiations. Now, this was a very long introductory to the current situation, but the current situation is as following. Like I said, we see that the path of negotiations is not the path that the Palestinians feel and believe that they can achieve what they want. What they want is a Palestinian state, but apparently the West Bank and the Gaza Strip is not enough. Today the Palestinians focus on 2 major paths: delegitimation and BDS, which are obviously connected together. Delegitimation is made by spreading out lies about Israel. Israel is dealing with the Palestinians the same way the Nazis treated the Jews in World War II. That is a lie, and unfortunately 38% of the Norwegian population that answered this survey agreed to this statement. The crimes against the Palestinians are the worst crimes ever made in history. That's another lie that helps delegitimize Israel as a sovereign state. The conflict is the origin for all conflicts in the world. All violent incidents in the world have direct relationship with this conflict. That doesn't make sense. But of course, when people hear those lies again and again and again, then the fact of Israel to exist is being challenged, the right, because a state acting like this does not have a right to exist. This is a quote that a famous quote. It goes like this: "The bigger the lie, the more people are likely to believe in it." And you know, it's true. Joseph Goebbels said this lie. I just read in Aftenposten a few days ago that the settlements, the Jewish settlements in the West Bank that are there from 1967 are the biggest obstacle to peace. That is a lie. That is a lie. Thank you. Israel proved that for peace, it will evacuate settlements. It will tear people from their homes. We proved it twice. We proved it in 1978 when we signed the peace agreement with Egypt, and we proved it in 2005 when we evacuated the Gaza Strip. Israel proved that for peace, it is willing to make painful consentments, is willing to give up land, give up territory for peace, is willing to evacuate for peace. And let me tell you what is the true obstacle for peace. It's not the settlements. The true obstacle for peace is the acknowledgement of Israel and the unwilling of the other side, of our partners for this conflict, to acknowledge Israel as a Jewish state. Ask the Palestinian leadership if for peace they are willing to acknowledge and to accept the fact that Israel has the right to live in the region as the nation state of the Jewish people. Ask them that simple question. The answer would be no. And that, my friends, that is the main obstacle for peace. Because the fact is that Israel is strong in this conflict with the Palestinians, but the Jewish state is a small minority in a region surrounded by hundreds of millions of angry Muslims. And the Middle East is not an easy place for a minority to be at. Look at what happens to Christians in the Middle East. Look what happens to Yazidis, to Baha'is in the Middle East. Also to Muslims, if you're not the right kind of Muslim in the Middle East, you suffer. The acknowledgement of this Jewish state, that's Israel's main thing that we demand in these negotiations to achieve peace in the Middle East. And the fact that the other side will not accept that, that is the main obstacle for peace. Tusen tak, Venner. Thank you for listening. And it's great to see a lot of supporters and a lot of people here that know the truth about Israel, that can see through the distorting haze of the deformed and twisted image too often, unfortunately, presented in the media about Israel. Thank you very much. Tusen tak.